Last time I had a class this large, as I said, was in 1978, just to finish the story, when I taught at UCLA. And I taught a class on California history, and it was actually in a larger auditorium in Royce Hall. And I stood on a stage like this. And it was fun. But the one thing I remember actually the student evaluations. The one I remember the most was the anonymous student who wrote that my pants were too short. So I don't stand on the stage anymore. So can you hear me okay now? Thank you all for coming. This is actually incredibly flattering and also very intimidating. In the audience are a number of experts that I'm not going to look at. I'm not going to look at them for the next few minutes. And then I've met a number of people, it's been a delight to meet you, who know a lot about this subject that I am not aware of. It is, however, the Oregon Donation Land Act as an influence in Oregon history is something that has bothered me for a generation. And it is a part of the book that Amy mentioned that is now very old, but still terrific. And my mother thought it was terrific. And I've always recommended it as a terrific kind of holiday gift item. But in any event, it's interested me for a generation. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is really not expert opinion, but a number of ideas that the Oregon Donation Act raises in my mind, and some thoughts about that with respect to Oregon history, both at the time of its enactment and also thereafter, including, if time allows, in my courage, and you haven't all left, at the end, some thoughts about it in relationship to Oregon right now. So what I want to do is talk, first of all, about what it was, and then secondly, about its consequences in terms of immigration to Oregon, about society in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, and so on, and about its relationship, some ideas about its relationship to state making, that's to say, the writing of the Oregon Constitution. Now let's see if this will work. Bingo, nice. So first of all, what it was, and this is actually just an exercise in going through some of the details that I went through over the last couple of weeks as I thought about this address to you. And in going over it, I was actually struck by kind of a number of attributes, both precursors to the Donation Act and also its actual provisions. First of all, there were a number of precursors. Above all, actually going back to the 1820s, but specifically in bills that Senator Lewis Lynn introduced in the U.S. Senate in 1839, 40, 41, and 42. What they had in common was that each of them held out something that was unprecedented in American history, and that was the granting to overland immigrants, settlers in Oregon, European American settlers in Oregon, 640 acres of land. That is 1 square mile. That's an enormous amount of property. As a matter of fact, in one of the acts, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm sure someone in here can correct me if I am, Lynn's bill included a 1,000-acre bounty for settlers. And in another one, I believe there was an extra 120 acres for every child under the age of 18. Now the intention, particularly when you think about including a bounty, an extra bounty for every child under the age of 18, is, to my mind, very telling in terms of what he wanted to do with the land of Oregon. Now, none of Lynn's bills ever passed the Senate, but they stood there as incentives, as models, as something that raised people's interest, provoked their considering Oregon as a possible place to move and the like. In 1843, however, this very, very small Oregon Territory, it wasn't part of the United States then, kind of the European American settlers in the Willamette Valley created a provisional government on their own hook. And as part of creating a provisional government, they enacted a land act. And in this act, kind of following up on Lynn, they included a provision that provided the right to settlers to claim up to 640 acres. And thousands of claims were made under the purported authority of the Provisional Government. Now finally, in 1850, 2 years after Oregon was actually established as a territory of the United States by the federal government, the Congress passed the Oregon Donation Law. So are you with me here? Okay. And in large part, it was enacted in order to make official, to respond to all the claims that had been made under the Provisional Government, and which had no standing in the territorial system. Now, in this act, there were two sections. There are two key sections. There were actually many sections, but two key sections for our purposes, or for my purposes. Section 4 and Section 5. And Section 4 really dealt with those who had made claims under the Provisional Government. And I've listed them on the, as I like to say to my classes, on the board up here. First of all, that the act was open to any person who was a resident of Oregon as of December 1850, which is to say the land claimants under the Provisional Government. The individual had to be 18 years of age, a white male citizen of the United States, or a non-citizen who declared his intention to naturalize. The individual had to live on and cultivate the claim for 4 years before they would receive a patent. The claims could extend up to 320 acres for a single male, and an additional 320 acres was open to a married couple, 320 acres in the name of the wife, for a total of 640 acres. That's to say, as I said before, a square mile, unprecedented. No previous land law in the United States had granted land of this extent for free. No subsequent land law of the United States would do so either. The Homestead Act of the Civil War Congress allowed up to 160 acres in a grant. And that's to say a quarter section, a quarter of the square mile. Do I see?
White males only that was offered?
Yes, it was. Yeah, and actually, it was white males. Actually, half-breed Indians were also incorporated into this, and that had to do with, as I understand it, with the presence of mixed-race families, French-Canadian and Indian families. But it was limited to white male citizens, tellingly, but not surprisingly. As a matter of fact, this became a common constitutional provision beginning in the 1820s in the United States. Before the 1820s, state constitutions had oftentimes not specified a racial limitation to citizenship, but beginning in the 1820s and then growing in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, this became a standard part of definitions of citizenship, limited to white men. And the Donation Act in this regard is both, it speaks forcefully in this regard, and it speaks not just for its own place and time, but in some sense for the period in United States history. Now, Section 5 was addressed to potential immigrants. And under this provision, say new immigrants to Oregon who arrived after 1850. Here, the claimant had to be 21 years old, again, a white citizen of the United States, or a non-citizen declaring their intention to naturalize. They had to likewise live on and cultivate the claim for 4 years. The claims for single males was limited to 160 acres, and with an additional 160 acres to a wife, and in the name of the wife, for a total of 320 acres. Now, in comparison to the Section 4 claims, this was downright kind of, not so good. But in the larger scheme of things, this is, again, an extraordinary bounty to potential settlers. Now, the consequences then and later, and as I've indicated I might want to talk about today, were profound, I think. First, the Donation Land Act was the means by which Oregon was conquered by the United States and integrated into an emerging continental nation state. The non-Indian European American population of Oregon increased from about 1,500 people in 1843 to 9,000 in 1849 to 13,000 in 1850, the year of the Act's implementation, to more than 50,000 in 1860. Oops, sorry, too quick. And this is, in some sense, a chart of kind of the accumulation of overland immigrants into the population of Oregon between 1840 and 1860. Oregon's population by 1860 was primarily made up of overland immigrants. And you can see how it escalates, it accelerates in the 1850s. So the first thing is that the Donation Land Act worked in terms of its author's intentions. It carried tens of thousands of family farmers to Oregon to make a claim. The second consequence that is significant is that the Donation Land Act was a foremost cause of the dispossession of Indian peoples in the Pacific Northwest. Now, others have written about this extensively, and it is an important aspect of it, an important aspect to understand about the consequences of the Donation Land Act. It extinguished Indian title informally through the sheer number of white settlers, both under the Provisional Government and following the passage of the Donation Land Act that arrived and took up claims. Alongside the Donation Land Act, Congress at the same time authorized commissioners to negotiate, or perhaps better put, impose treaties on Indians throughout the Pacific Northwest, which over time removed native peoples from areas not only encompassed by the act, but throughout the entire region. In addition, again, arriving waves of European American Donation Land Act claimants increased the level of interpersonal violence against Indian people and instigated and participated in formal state and U.S. sanctioned wars of removal. So the second rather immediate consequence of the Donation Land Act was the dispossession of Indian peoples. The third consequence was getting the hang of this, was the transfer of the vast majority of the productive property and land in the territory and the state, and its transfer to a specific fragment of the United States population. This is a map. It's not a great map, but I think it's actually a pretty evocative map of the location of the donation land claims. In the end, there were more than 7,400 claims. They encompassed more than 2.6 million acres. Most of it was in the Willamette Valley. The average size of claims was more than 350 acres. Now, in this regard, the Donation Land Act drew thousands of farming families from primarily the Midwestern United States. And images such as this, then and now, kind of identify the population that took advantage of the act. Economically, it established family farm agriculture as the basis of the Oregon economy. There's the second one. And what is notable about these images, if you go on the web and you ask to see images of the Oregon Trail, this is what you come up with. And it's not surprising, but perhaps a little later I'll make the case, maybe successfully, that it's striking in its own ways, that these images are always images of families. And of families on farms. Some better, some nicer than others. Where am I? Oh, can't see that yet. This is the world that the Donation Land Act created. Politically, the Donation Land Act claimants, by their very number, dominated Oregon politics from the 1850s forward, as voters and as office holders. Socially, the same population wielded the power to decide who could come and who could stay by virtue of their land ownership. And again, I just point out now some people don't like this kind of a comment in 2014, but I think it's fair to say that in 2014, as was the case in 1850 and 1855, the Willamette Valley is Oregon. I mean, even today, I think it's 75% of the population of Oregon lives in the Willamette Valley. I got some mumbles about that. I can see. Close enough, okay. The transfer of this property in land to the Donation Land Act claimants was complete by 1855, in 5 years. Now, the actual patents took much longer in many, many cases, extending. Actually, one of the members of the audience was telling me about an instance where the actual patent wasn't finally resolved until the 20th century. So that could take a long time. But the actual transfer took place within a few short years. As a consequence of this, Oregon became remarkably homogeneous in terms of the population. I can't read my writing here for some reason. What did I write there? Okay. That's to say the people were, on many measures, just like each other. And I think that's important to bear in mind. A specific population was targeted, they responded, and they created a state. The vast majority of its inhabitants were of similar backgrounds, of similar minds, and of similar economic and social position. Oregon became a society of the middling sort, of farming families, mostly from the Midwest, who had the resources to make the trip, no small matter. They had the capacity to forego a farming season, again, no small matter, to make the 6-month trek to Oregon. Among their motives, the experience of Midwestern farming in the 1830s was, I think, profound. And Midwestern farming, the broad Midwest from which the vast majority of the overland immigrants came, was marked by boom and bust throughout the 1830s, by the rapid rise of commercial agriculture, farming families who planted for sale, and found themselves enmeshed in what was becoming in the 1830s a global market for agricultural staples that was anything but certain in terms of how it treated small farmers in the United States and actually elsewhere around the globe. Generally speaking, agricultural prices over the 1830s and into the early 1840s declined as the number of farms, both in the United States and elsewhere, increased as global competition appeared, for example, from South America. A vicious cycle for those who were ruined by the economic ups and downs of the agricultural economy in the 1830s, followed from global production increasing supply, which had the consequence of reducing prices. Kind of a simple equation. Supply went up, prices went down. In response, what generally farmers would do was to behave rationally. And to behave rationally in a setting where the price you're receiving for a crop is lower this year than next year is to increase your crop, to produce more, to make up the difference. That's not smart? Well, if you have a macroeconomic view of things, one can afford a macroeconomic view, it's not smart. But from the seat of the farm, it's what you have under your control to do. That's to increase your production to make up the gap between last year's revenues and this year's revenues. And of course, as you may have noted, when farmers collectively do this, it only makes the situation worse. It reduces prices again and again and again. So over the 1830s and 1840s, there was generally a secular decline in the price of many agricultural commodities. And the other thing that farmers would do to deal with these situations was to go into debt, to actually borrow against, and actually farmers are always borrowing money, they're always in debt, but to borrow even more to make up the gap between last year's income and this year's cost of putting in a crop, so on and so forth. Debt took on a life of its own. This culminated in a series of panics, the worst one beginning in 1837 and extending by some measures well into the 1840s. And when you think about it, this is the world from which so many of these Donation Land Act claimants came to Oregon. Now, they weren't ruined by the panics, but they certainly were witness to the kind of ruination that the ups and downs of the agricultural economy in the Midwest of the 1830s meant for so many of their neighbors. They are, in this regard, a population who both sought and could afford to escape the perils of the market in the agricultural Midwest. They are those who saw in this a chance to secure a competence for their families. As a matter of fact, in some sense, more than a competence, a veritable kingdom in comparison to the farming property of the Midwest in the 1830s. They were struck by the outsized, in addition to the size of the grants, they were struck by the outsized reports of the Willamette Valley's richness and fertility, by its mild climate, by the fact that plants and goods, agricultural goods, grew by themselves. It was also, for them, an opportunity to secure the future of their children. The very size of the claims, 640 acres, was far beyond what a family farming labor force could actually cultivate. Taking into consideration the technology of farming technology, agricultural technology in the middle of the 19th century, and also taking into account that these family farmers in Oregon, even more so than was the case in the Midwest, were limited in terms of the labor at their command. It was limited to the members of their family. 640 acre farms or 320 acre farms meant that the people were very, very isolated from one another. There was no ready supply of agricultural laborers that could be hired on. And so the family size itself was a significant limitation in terms of the number of acres that farmers could actually put into use. And it was nowhere near 320 acres, much less 640 acres. And in this regard, I think that one way to think about this is part of a family strategy, to actually have at one's command the land that can protect one's children from the perils that the family had witnessed, so to speak, back home in the Middle West. In this regard, the DLA brought to the Oregon country, not profit maximizers, but a population of Americans wary of the workings of the market economy. Now, if they weren't seeking escape from the modern world, they were seeking a place and a way to control its known consequences, to keep it at arm's length, to prioritize family security, conceivably across generations through their children. Now, how could this be the case? That's to say they weren't modern in the most common sense of the word. Let me offer 3 points in this regard. First of all, the very size, as I mentioned earlier, of the donation land claims outstripped the capacity of a family to farm. Where is that? Okay, there you go. And this is just a little bar graph that shows the size of Oregon farms relative to the size of the world that they had left. It is likely that to some degree, and perhaps a significant degree, these immigrants saw their claims as capital, that's to say, property to be sold for a profit. But to some degree as well, they saw it as a family resource, a means of providing for generations to come. Now, secondly, and in my sense, kind of profoundly, consider the timing of the land rush to Oregon. Basically, it took place in a small way in the 1840s, but the explosion, so to speak, begins in 1850. Now, if you think about it for a moment, it's clear, and perhaps even those of you who have never left Oregon and headed south of here, but if you think about the timing of the land rush to Oregon, Oregon was not in the 1850s the only game in town. It coincided with a much larger and considerably different, as in worldwide, migration to the California gold rush. Now, my third point is going to be about, and I'll get to that later, is the way in which these Oregonians decided to govern themselves in writing the state constitution in 1857, the social vision expressed in that document. I've already talked about my first point, the size of the donation claims, the kinds of families it drew. Let me turn to my second point, which has to do with the contrast between the Oregon land rush and the California gold rush. And I'll start with a tale that I encountered a long time ago, and I'm sure you've all heard it, but I like it, so I'm going to repeat it anyway. I first encountered this in Dorothy Johanson's Empire on the Columbia, I believe. And it goes like this. This is a story that Oregonians like to tell about the trails west in 1850. Because at Pacific Springs, it reads, that's where the Oregon Trail separated from the trail to California. A pile of gold-bearing quartz marked the direction to the gold fields. The other trail was marked by a sign to Oregon. And you know the punchline. Those who could read took the trail to Oregon. Now, Oregons love this apocryphal tale. And I can tell you that in my own experience, Californians just don't get it. I've told it to Californians, and it produces only an odd look about what does this possibly mean. Now, see, but Oregonians completely get it. The appeal isn't gold, is it? It's something else. Regardless, the tale points out a vast gulf between these two stunning mid-19th century migrations. Both held out unprecedented incentives, land on the one hand, gold on the other. But these were very different incentives indeed, both of which passed on control of these states' productive property, land and gold, to distinctive fragment populations of actually the United States and the world. I've already described the Oregonians drawn to the far west by the Donation Land Act. Let me turn briefly to California. The contrast is instructive. The California gold rush appealed to, first, an opportunity to hit a jackpot, overnight riches. Secondly, an opportunity to quickly and steadily accumulate money, capital, through any multitude of markets, businesses, rackets, that the mining population created, that's to say, the business of mining the miners. The California gold rush was decidedly market-driven. The gold rush drew a distinctive body of migrants, especially in comparison to Oregon. Okay, there's the Oregon immigrants. There's the California immigrants. What's the difference? First of all, it was constituted largely on the order of 75 to 80% and higher of young men between the ages of 17 to 35. They're drawn from across the globe, from all over the world. In that regard, the migration to California was diverse. It was global. It included immigrants from Latin America, Asia, Africa, Europe, as well as the United States. Thirdly, it was itinerant. Gold rush miners and merchants and capitalists were constantly on the move, not settled, in search of the main chance. Tens of thousands of these young men circulated in and out of California in the 1850s and beyond. In contrast, the Oregonians came, settled, and stayed. And finally, the California gold rush migration was enormous. More young men. The migration to California was enormous. It eclipsed the migration, which was not small, but it eclipsed the migration to Oregon. By 1860, the California population was approximately 400,000 people. That was young, still largely male, diverse, still itinerant. Now, so those are two ways, I think, to triangulate our understanding of the Oregon Donation Land Act and its influence in terms of shaping Oregon history and Oregon society. My third point, and I'm going to have to hurry up, aren't I? Darn it, because I'm only halfway through. Okay. Let me try to be quick about this. My third point actually has to do with something that's near and dear to my heart, and that has to do with the Oregon Constitution. This book I wrote many, many years ago, which is in part about the writing of the Oregon Constitution, the ideas that it expressed, in contrast to other state constitutions, California's and Nevada's. And what I found there, and still believe to be the case, is that the Oregon Constitution, the formation of the Oregon Constitution, was infused with anachronistic political and ideological concepts and a language that harkened back to the 18th century, to controversies of that turned around the American Revolution and the era of the U.S. Constitution. My reading of the Oregon constitutional debates led me to conclude that these Oregonians were drawing upon what early American scholars, or scholars of the Revolutionary Constitutional period, identified as the language of what they called classical republicanism. According to these scholars, writing in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, classical republicanism was a lost language of politics, one that contrasted dramatically from the conventional 20th century understanding of the Revolution and the Constitution. The conventional understanding, against which these advocates of classical republicanism argued, was that the ideas behind the Revolution, and in turn the Constitution, were grounded in the individualistic philosophy of John Locke, known as Lockean liberalism. The Revolution, according to this Lockean perspective, had been fought and won in order to unleash the striving of individual citizens. That is, the point was individual liberty. That's what the Revolution was about. That's what the Constitution sought to preserve and encourage. This followed Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations in terms of the idea that the Revolution was fought on the grounds that a society composed of self-seeking individuals, people enjoying liberty, collectively, by the very act of seeking their individual self-interest, produced the common good. It's like the magic consequence of liberty. It produced the best of all possible worlds. Today, this line of thinking is often understood as libertarianism. See Rand Paul. In contrast, advocates of a classical Republican understanding of revolutionary and constitutional practice, that's to say thought and action, held that far from seeking to unleash the private energies of atomistic individuals, the so-called founding fathers held to a set of ideas drawn from what they considered the lessons of English history and of the ancient republics. In this view, a republic required the presence in its citizenry of three characteristics. First was independence, and by this they meant material independence from other men. The most salient marker of independence thus understood was ownership of land, on which and from which a citizen could provide for the needs of his family, and thus establish his family's material independence from others. So the first thing is an independent citizenry that couldn't be pushed around by other people. Second was the condition of equality. Now, what these 18th century Republicans meant by this was not statistical equality, but rather, let's say everybody had the same amount of property, for example, but rather equality in terms of everyone enjoying independence from the will of other people, so that their decisions would be indeed their decisions, not determined, not organized by other people. You with me? The third quality they called political virtue. And this concept followed from the first independence and the second equality. By this was meant the quality of civic selflessness, disinterestedness, commitment to the common good, as opposed to a commitment to one's own individual self-interest. So the story went. Only in a society marked by citizens independent of the will of others, equal in their capacity to meet their family's needs, was civic virtue possible. As a matter of fact, some of the real, you could say, utopian end of this line of thinking was that if people are freed from the bonds of others, they will naturally become virtuous, because that is in some sense the natural state of human beings. Not self-interest, not self-seeking, not greed, and the like, but rather a natural commitment to the common good. I'm not so sure about that, but ardent revolutionaries oftentimes would make that claim. According to this line of reasoning, the greatest threat to Republican virtue was commerce. Commerce injected interest into politics. As such, commerce acted as a solvent to independence, equality, and virtue. Importantly, I also want to note that the ideology of classical republicanism also stood foursquare on a conception of a homogeneous population, a strikingly homogeneous population. Homogeneous socially, economically, and politically. And it was not by chance that the greatest spokesman for this Republican line of thinking in the 18th and indeed into the 19th century outside of Oregon were slaveholders from the South, like James Madison and George Washington. Because slavery removed a number of the enormous practical problems that this conception of a republic entailed. The problem of the poor, that's to say, the dependent, and which was solved in the ancient republics by what? By slavery. So homogeneity was a hallmark of Republican thinking in the 18th century. Now, why introduce all this seemingly and perhaps actually irrelevant talk about the 17th and 18th centuries? What does it have to do with the Donation Land Act and Oregon? Well, it has this to do with it. According to my reading of these debates, the writers of the Oregon Constitution and the men who went on to actually shape and dominate much of Oregon politics to the end of their lives really stood on this same discourse. It appears in many parts of the Constitution. And here let me mention just one, although it probably too much length. And this has to do with the debate over the article in the Oregon Constitution on corporations. Precisely, the issue was whether to include what's called a limited liability clause or an unlimited liability clause. And this was not unique to Oregon in the 19th century. State governments and constitution writers were facing this all over the place. The difference was this. Under a limited liability regime in terms of the organization of corporations, it's basically what we have today. If you invest in a corporation, you adventure your money in buying stock, and that corporation should go bankrupt or break the law or any other kind of form of misfeasance or malfeasance, you're out only the cost of your investment. You lose your investment in the stock. Okay? Under a regime of unlimited liability, it's different. In this case, stockholders are liable for all debts the corporation faces, all liabilities, in proportion to their stock ownership. So let's say you own 10% of the stock in, I don't know, Enron. So you own let's say you own 1% of the stock in Enron. When Enron goes south, you are personally on the hook for 1% of the claims, the liabilities of the Enron Corporation. It sounds good to me. Well, this was before the Oregon Constitution. They were debating which way to go. And I'm just going to read to you one of my favorite passages from the Constitutional Convention. They're the remarks of Matthew Deedy, who was the president of the convention and a fairly significant guy in the history of Oregon, and you could say in the history actually of American law for his career after Oregon statehood. Here's what Deedy said. He is arguing for unlimited liability. Actually, he's in favor, as he puts it here. I am not myself, Mr. Chairman, favorable to the creation of corporations. I do not want to encourage a fungus growth of speculators in this country. How much better off will we be than now, as to say, if corporations are encouraged? Contrast your own condition with the countries that have manufactories scattered over them. They have millions of wealth and millions of poor human beings degraded into the condition of mere servants of machinery, overtasked and overworked, and seething in misery and crime from the age of puberty to the grave. Contrast their condition with the condition of your own people, that's to say, Oregonians, breathing the pure air with a canopy of heaven for a ventilator, and then tell me with whom is the preference. Everyone must admit that the preference is with us, and why? It is with us simply for the reason that we yet retain our individual independence, point one, and have not become absorbed by these institutions which dwarf the energies of the body and soul. That is the reason why we are superior in condition to them. True, we do not produce as many yards of cloth as does Old England, nor as many pegs as New England. We have not their riches, nor yet their abject poverty. But we have a condition of things where the happiness and wealth that falls to the lot of each individual is to manufacturing communities unknown. We have an agricultural community and the domestic virtues incident to an agricultural people. And there is where you look for the true and solid wealth and happiness of a people. In this we are vastly superior to the manufacturing countries. Power, political and otherwise, is in the hands of capitalists. There are many people dependent on them, and dependence begets servility. The people have grown up on it, and they are fit for no other occupation. They are utterly dependent upon the manufacturers for a living and must do their bidding. I am not in favor of such a state of things here. I'm not in favor of encouraging a fungus growth of improvement in this country. Now, it's a complicated story. I don't have time to tell, but I don't think he lost. How many of you are in favor of a fungus growth of improvement in this country? And I'll bet you, if you told the truth and I said, would you vote for an initiative, maybe we could start one up, to introduce unlimited liability, that a few of you nuts would actually vote for it. One of them would be me. Okay. Now, Deedy was, I think, very, where's my page 12? There it is. I lost my place. There we go. Deedy was, I think, an eloquent speaker. But he was not alone. There were others that went right along with him who were actually long-standing presences in Oregon public affairs. Reuben Boyce, for example, any of you from Salem might be familiar with his name, George Williams, Lafayette Grover, and others, joined him in inveighing against the dangerous potential that corporations held out against their understanding of Oregon. Their reasoning was not modern. It was not aimed at encouraging manufacturing and commerce. Rather, it conjured up a vocabulary and a concept of political society more in line with the 18th century than their own time. There are other examples I could cite, but I'm out of time. I will note, however, that Dede and others was not a flash in the pan. Another notable feature of the Oregon Constitution in this land of donation land claims was that its members stayed around. Now, 19th century politics in general is marked by what's called rapid turnover in office holding. And especially as the century wore on, what political scientists have found is that people circulated through these offices willy-nilly, but not in Oregon. The cast of characters who dominated the first generation or actually dominated territorial politics in the 1850s, the Donation Land Act generation, remained in office, in power, to a striking degree to the closing decades of the 19th century and even into the 20th. For example, Dede himself. He was appointed to the federal bench by President Abraham Lincoln in 1861, and he remained there as District Judge of Oregon until his death in 1893. Dede, I should note, and this is a great subject for research, ruled on more than a few cases having to do with women's property rights according to the Donation Land Act. And it was the case that he was not friendly to women in court. Take also, for example, George Williams, Dede's colleague in the Constitutional Convention. He went on to the U.S. Senate. During the Civil War, he claimed to be the author of the 14th Amendment, which I think is far-fetched, but he claimed it nonetheless. He was a member of President U.S. Grant's cabinet. He was Attorney General of the United States. And he was, a generation after that, in the early 20th century, elected mayor of Portland. Or finally, take William Packwood. He was the last member of the Oregon Constitutional Convention to hold office in Oregon, and he was also a donation land claimant. Packwood retired as the municipal judge of Baker City in 1910, and he died 7 years later. 1910 is what? 53 years after the Oregon Constitutional Convention. He died in 1917. 45 years after that, his great-grandson became the youngest member of the state legislature before going on to higher office. That would be Senator Bob Packwood, and that's a different story altogether. But their presence, I think, and I'll close with this in just a few final remarks, is that the Donation Land Act claimants, their presence, I think, is felt in the state even today in terms of lines on the land and in terms of the ways in which Oregonians peculiarly think about their state and its politics and the nature of its society. So I had some other things to talk about, but I am definitely out of time, aren't I, Amy?
I have no idea what time it is.
Oh, it's 7:55. So Century Farms is one thing I wanted to talk about. The commemoration of, beginning in 1957, of farms at least 100 years old, basically donation land farms. And then the last two things, which I didn't get to, which I wanted to start with actually, was the show called Portlandia. You know, it's a peculiar show. It's a parody, but it's a parody. But parodies always have a grain of truth, and it seems to me that Portlandia, in some sense, celebrates the nutty side of Oregonians that arrived with the Donation Land Act. Well, artisanal, cooking, music, furniture making, the instinct of workmanship. The last thing,
We could pickle that.
okay. The last thing that I didn't get to talk about, which I think is germane here, and I'll just put this out as something for you to consider, and that is the writings of the 19th century economist, philosopher Thorstein Veblen, who is known as the Bard of Savagery. And in his case, his inverted history of the rise, or of the history of civilization, was actually an inverted one. It was not a rise to civilization, it was actually a descent from the virtues of savagery, in which people were marked by an instinct of workmanship, to the state of the United States in the 1880s and 1890s, the Gilded Age, where all anybody wanted to do, the sign of virtue, rested in one's ability to consume and waste. And in some sense, one could say, I think, that Oregonians in this regard expressed a certain hankering towards the virtuous savagery that Veblen celebrated in his own work. Okay, I will stop there. I apologize for going on for so long. I'd love to have any of you correct my mistakes. Okay.